So this is probably a bit heavy for the first morning of a conference. It's usually full of hellos and thank yous, but imagine the ocean. Imagine being in its waters for the first time, the limitless, terrifying immensity of it. To see it is to be silenced by it, to be made speechless by its vastness. I was but a young girl when I was taken. The shore that was my home growing ever smaller on the horizon behind me until it disappeared altogether from view. It was the last time I saw my land. No longer a girl, I'm 20 now. I still dream of my country, of my family, my brother and sisters, but less and less. I wondered what would become of them, but although I may be young in years, I already know enough of this world, enough of men, to know I will never see them again. You could say I have already lived many lives, first in Lisboa, but now here in Antwerp, a place stranger to me still, and all of the crowded towns and cities in between, following Master João Brandão wherever his business takes him. I do not like it very much here in Antwerp, especially in winter, when I can hardly feel my fingers and toes. And come the heat of summer, it smells like fish. But it's April now, and not for the first time, the German arrived at the house some days ago. My master was excited to see him and shows him much reverence. He is called Albrecht. The two are most familiar. I've been told he's an important man, a maker of images from the town of Nuremberg to the east. He's traveling on a long one-year journey and will be lodging here. To be honest, I pray it will not be long. Tall, slim, and sinewy, with a powerful nose like a hawk, but his neck is too long. And never in my life have I ever encountered a man so hairy. He's very vain. Why has God given me such magnificent talent? He once told my master. It is a curse as well as a blessing. Imagine. And he is awfully proud of his reddish-brown mustache, which curls upward like a vine. His hair and even his beard smell of perfume. I know when he's coming from a room away. Still, he has an alert head and brilliant eyes that shine. His fingers, it's hard to look away. None more beautiful can ever have been seen. And there is such a music and charm in his utterance. I have heard it said that his listeners could not but be sorry when he ceased to speak, even when they do not understand his language, as I do not. Master Brandão told me that in his tongue, my Christian name is Catarina, which means, of course, in his tongue, pure. I did not know this. He is more than twice my years, and he's always staring. Almost everything he encounters in the house seems a novelty, and nothing is beyond or beneath his notice. I suppose I'm a novelty to him too. This is the second occasion he has brought me a gift, this time a brooch of agate. He bade me wear it on my headdress. I knew I could not refuse. This morning he made me sit for a portrait, and again I knew I could not refuse. He took his time, on occasion twirling that mustache of his, focusing my eyes instead on the floor tiles below. I could not bear to look at him. The corner of that room was the last place I wanted to be, and I could not wait to be free of him, to be alone. The reality, of course, as all of you here I'm sure know, is that Katerina, in fact, left us no personal trace of her life, expressed in language that was hers to possess. Her past instead speaks, however faintly, through Dürer's drawing in the Uffizi, yet it too must be acknowledged as a site of loss. Still, her presence also beats in the briefest of lines penned in Dürer's travel journal, recording a journey to the Netherlands between July 1520 and July 1521 with his wife Agnes. The Uffizi drawing is one that he made between March 16th and April 5th in 1521, while staying in the household of João Brandão, the King of Portugal's factor or commercial agent in Antwerp. I made the portrait in charcoal of the factor Brandão, Dürer notes, proceeding to add, as if listing, I drew the portrait in metal point of his Moor. His account is, of course, my account is, needless to say, a fiction. It's a fiction told imperfectly in words. I've taken the liberty, and it is a big liberty, of imagining it once belonging to Caterina, reflecting unknowable thoughts behind her averted eyes. Hers is a voice we may never be able to recover. The impulse to imagine, however, speaks to the portrait's extraordinary emotional charge, its unmistakable suggestion of introspection and inner life. How can one not be moved to ask questions of Caterina's lived identity? If only such silent hauntings could be empowered to speak, what personal tales would they tell? Visually, Dürer's drawing is indeed ghostly in its network of pale lines, especially fine in its mark-making and its delicacy. Eschewing the rapid strokes of black chalk, Dürer has chosen silver point, a technique demanding the utmost precision and steady confidence of hand. The paper surface requires a special preparation for the metal to leave a mark, any mark, and thus must be coated with an opaque white or tinted ground composed of lead-white powdered bone, pigment, and gum water. The oxidation on metal's contact with the bone surface produces a delicate, almost shimmering gray-silver line. This is to say, it is a technique that requires great attentiveness and, above all, care. In studying this sheet again with as much care of my own as I could 1 week ago, I found but one almost imperceptible pentimento, one faint line betraying a change in the contour of Caterina's left shoulder proper. It's almost invisible. Dürer paid special attention to the modeling of Caterina's distinct features, as evidenced by the soft whispers of hatching in the shadows. Not even the tiny wisps of hair barely peeking out from beneath her cap escape his eye. The same must be said of Caterina's quite costly attire, from her head brooch, its reflective surface indicated with slight vertical squiggles, to the watered silk surface of her bodice. Dürer's is a mesmerizing image, not simply for its technical virtuosity or fidelity to material or materiality, but rather for what lies beneath its surface, its quiet emotional power and psychological poignancy. It is a portrait of profound sadness. The Uffizi drawing is rather small, measuring only 20 by 14 centimeters, roughly commensurate with the dimensions of a travel journal. Dürer especially embraced silver point during his sojourn to the Netherlands, most famously in a surviving sketchbook, which he called My Little Book. But Caterina's portrait is of different dimensions and was drawn independently on a separate sheet. It bears a watermark, a Gothic P with a flower, which has been identified with paper produced in northeast France, Netherlands, and the lower Rhine region. This is to say, we know more about the paper on which Caterina's likeness is drawn than we know about her true origins or even her true name. It is perhaps the material luxury or relative luxury of her dress that has led Caterina to most often be called, or to often be called, I should say, a servant. In reality, she is, however, more likely a slave. It was most likely in Portugal, upon having been bought or traded for by João Brandão, that she was dispossessed of her birth name, taking on the Christian name of Caterina. In Portugal, the mandatory baptism of slaves was introduced by Pope Nicholas V in the mid-15th century, although it was not regarded as a priority in practice. Meanwhile, slavery was illegal in Antwerp and the rest of the Low Countries, although the actual word slave did not convey much legal meaning. Whatever Caterina's legal status, and no matter her form of dress, the social hierarchy remained the same. Her life was one of servitude. And so the visual testament of Dürer's by his hand has granted us an important fragment of a story. The question nonetheless remains, whose story is it? In the case of the present drawing, the phrase "to capture a likeness" strikes me as being as painfully literal as it is figurative. It is this attendant feeling of unease implicit in having anyone's appearance recorded, and we have to assume without Caterina having much of a say in the matter, if at all. It's this unease that may explain the unmistakable sorrow in her expression, one that goes far beyond the melancholy of domestic routines. Dürer himself, then 49, 50 years of age, had captured Katharina's outward likeness with the same meticulous care as he had inventoried every detail of every discovery, transaction, and encounter, be it human or animal, during his year-long journey to the Netherlands. The sitter represented here at right, Lazarus von Ravensburger, is recorded as having gifted Dürer, quote, a big fish dish, 5 snail shells, 4 silver and 5 copper medals, 2 dried fish, white coral, 4 arrows, and another white coral, all to the artist's extreme delight. This is the kind of stuff that Dürer absolutely adored. While a guest in the home of this man, another Portuguese friend of Dürer's in Antwerp, the business agent Rodrigo Fernandes de Almada, Dürer records, Rodrigo gave me one of the parrots. And this is probably not the parrot. This is an earlier parrot. Dürer had an entire menagerie. Just to be clear, we're all historians here, so I want to be precise. I don't want to get any messages tomorrow. That is not the right. This is a different parrot. In fact, there, as you'll see, there are multiple avian gifts that Rodrigo bestowed on Dürer. Quote, Rodrigo gave me one of the parrots coming from Malaga. And this ended up, again, being one of 3 green parrots. I gave his servant a tip of 5 pfennigs. Dürer was constantly tipping maids and servants. And I have paid 2 additional pfennigs for a bird cage. I've also paid 3 pfennigs for a couple of new parts for my pants. It was, in fact, as I'm sure many of you recognize, for Rodrigo that near the end of Dürer's stay in Antwerp, he completed this St. Jerome, which to me is a portrait, an actual portrait of spiritual ardency. It's such an impassioned image, and it was based on a study of a 93-year-old man whom Dürer also tipped for sitting for him. And that is the drawing that we see from the Albertina at left. And here we see also sketches from this trip that I also cannot help but visualize as a kind of spiritual portrait of Dürer's own nomadic mind. These are various figural sketches for the patron saint of travelers, Saint Christopher. Unlike Katharina, Dürer has bequeathed to us, therefore, a remarkable and very full private record, written and visual. It still bears asking, however, if Dürer's drawing of Katharina has not, at times, somewhat fetishized his responses to the people and the places that he has seen, fetishized them almost as an extension or even a projection of the artist himself. It has been called one of the artist's tenderest works, quote unquote, the drawing of Katharina in the Uffizi. It has been interpreted in the past as a testament not only to his supreme technical skill and observation as a draftsman, but also Dürer's deep empathy as a human being. There is no denying the former, the technical virtuosity of the Uffizi drawing and everything that he sketched in the Netherlands. However, what do we in fact know of the latter? To be sure, Dürer was obsessed with bodies, including his own, as attested by this abject self-image at right, one of the artist's no fewer than 13 self-portraits, this one recording himself in a mirror in his early to mid-30s. Dürer's physical appearance, from his mustache down to his calves, is also known thanks to a description of the 16th century German classicist, philologist, and historian Joachim Camerarius the Elder. And in fact, it was his biography of Dürer for the introduction of the Latin translation of the artist's 4 books of human proportion in 1528 that I used in my imagined account of Katharina's that I read out to you before. It was in an earlier draft for the penultimate book in the same treatise, dating circa 1513, that Dürer makes the following pronouncement, and I have to say this is very difficult to hear, still more to read aloud, I think, for anyone. Dürer writes in his 4 books of human proportion, in this early draft, a large difference can be observed between white and Moorish people. They are still human beings, and many of the proportions of these Black people are usable, that is, as models for artistic portrayal. Usable for their beauty, although Black people's faces are rarely beautiful to look at. In the aesthetic discourse in the printed text of the 4 books, Dürer proceeded to write, Moors' faces are rarely beautiful because of their squashed noses and thick lips. Similarly, their shin bones and knees as well are too bony, not so good to look upon as those of the whites. And so also it is with their hands. He then concedes, however, I have seen some of them whose whole bodies were so well shaped and so pleasing that I have neither seen nor can imagine any better formed. Dürer's cold-eyed ambivalence about what he perceives to be the physical characteristics of Black Africans is very typical of the period. While he stereotypes and disparages their facial features as unattractive to the point of grotesque caricature, he extols the form and strength of their bodies. Looking south of the Alps, we also find Ascanio Condivi's detailed description, also very difficult to speak aloud, of Michelangelo's fascination with the corpse of a Black African man. Quote, Michelangelo also began to discuss his theories on the human body with Messer Rialdo Colombo, a very superior anatomist and surgeon and a particular friend of Michelangelo's and mine, who sent him for this purpose the corpse of a Moor, a most handsome young man, and insofar as one could say, most suitable. And it was placed in St. Agatha, where I was and still am living, because of it being a remote place. On this corpse, Michelangelo showed me many rare and recondite things, perhaps never before understood, all of which I noted and hope one day to publish with the help of some learned man for the convenience and use of all who want to work in painting and sculpture. As it happens, Condivi's account follows directly on the heels of a passage disparaging none other than Dürer and his anatomical studies as lacking in attention to human movement and gesture. Quote, Condivi writes, I know very well that when Michelangelo reads Albrecht Dürer, he finds his work very weak, as he discusses only the proportions and varieties of human bodies for which no fixed rule can be given, and he forms his figures straight upright like poles. Whether described in word or image in the early modern period, it grows very clear that Black bodies were repeatedly divested of personhood. They were essentially seen as just that, material bodies, or worse, human specimens. And of course, Scott Nethersoul here is with us. And I'm showing you an image that I'm sure is very familiar to you from his work and other colleagues' work on the so-called miracle of the black leg, in which the corpse of a Black man is exhumed and then mutilated to make a white man whole. It should come as little surprise then that Black African men, or Moors as they were repeatedly categorized, were often represented also for very particular physical characteristics as being strong men, brutal tormentors, towering executioners, as you can see here at right. Even in an image that I know also someone in the audience here is very familiar with, even actual giants, as in this example in the Fradi in Venice. Time again, Black bodies are fetishized, sexualized for their exotic allure, and more often than perhaps anything else, made to live on the margins. But then again, startling exceptions do flash out from history, out from the margins. None more striking than that of the remarkable Juan de Pareja, whose story will be Carmen Fraquia's to tell at the end of our conference. Here shown in one of the most famous paintings in the world as a model and yet still a slave, but in 4 years' time to be a free man and an independent maker of images in his own right. In 2012, Black British artist and filmmaker John Akomfrah created an 18-minute film called Peripeteia, which reimagines not only our Caterina's journey, but in fact her shared destiny with the life of another of Dürer's subjects, this subject without a name, a Black man represented here in a black chalk drawing in the Albertina. They have often been considered to be companions, even though they were recorded by Dürer well over a decade apart. The title of Akomfra's film is a Greek word, peripeteia, referring to a reversal of circumstances or a turning point. And this is the image that inspired John Akomfra to reimagine the life of the man recorded in 1505, perhaps 1508, in the Vienna drawing, traveling through treacherous terrain to meet Caterina. This is really one of the most extraordinary films that I have ever witnessed. And while Caterina's own words, her own voice may be lost to us forever, her memory in all of its mediated and painful complexity lives on. A turning point has indeed been reached, as Akomfra also reimagines. Reimagines what it means to be free at any cost and what it means to go home. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Paul Kaplan. Paul Kaplan is a professor of art history at Purchase College, State University of New York. He is a specialist in the political dimensions, the dimension of Venetian Renaissance painting, and in the representation of people of African descent in European and American art from the Middle Ages through the 19th century. He is the author of The Rise of the Black Magus in Western Art, that's 1985 published, Contraband Guides, Race, Transatlantic Culture and the Arts in the Civil War Area, published in 2020, and African Venice, published last year. He was also a contributor to volumes 2, 3, and 4 of Harvard University's presses, The Image of the Black in Western Art. And he served as a project scholar for the artist Fred Wilson's Speak of Me as I Am. And that's an installation in the American Pavilion at the 2003 Venice Biennale. Professor Kaplan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you all for being here. I just want to mention that I think it was 24 years ago, Kate Lowe and one of her British colleagues set up one of the very first conferences of this kind. Kate's in the audience, of course, and it's wonderful to see the movement that I think was set off there in a scholarly way, continuing to roll forward. Perversely, I want to begin a talk deliberately focused on Florentine art with a few words about Venice. Last February, the Venetian publisher Wetlands, directed by Luca Costantini, published African Venice. I said I would wave it around, and I have. A guidebook to the Black presence in that city's art and life, which I co-authored with the Venetian literary scholar Shaul Bassi. There's also an Italian version of this volume, Venezia Africana, as you can see there. My contribution, the more prosaic backbone of this book, is a series of walking tours around Venice, highlighting the hundreds of images of Black Africans that can still be seen in the churches, museums, and civic buildings of that lagoon city. My co-author, an Othello specialist, concentrates on Blackness in the literary image of Venice, as well as on the marks of Italy's colonial adventures still discernible in the city. And Shaul, my collaborator, brought in brought in over a dozen other distinguished contributors, many of whom focus on the experience of African and Afro-descended residents of and visitors to modern Venice. The goal, very much in line with the theme of this conference, was to bring attention to the substantial role of Africa and Africans in Venetian culture and society, to illuminate precisely those hidden in plain sight, so that they would become visible not only to scholars, but also to the widest possible public, black and white, residents and travelers, including the armchair kind, Venetian, Italian, European, African, American, global. While this kind of guidebook, narrowly speaking, is a new artifact, it's part of a movement to render the long history of Blackness in Europe broadly accessible and has distinguished predecessors. For example, the Image of the Black in Western Art Research Project, already mentioned, along with its photo archives and volumes, begun by the Menil Foundation in the 1960s and recently completed by Skip Gates Hutchins Center at Harvard. The Revealing the African Presence in Renaissance Europe exhibition, also previously referenced at the Walters Museum in Baltimore in 2013. The Posing Modernity and Modèle Noir exhibitions in New York and at the Musée d'Orsay about 6 years ago. The Getty Museum's 2023 Balthazar volume exploring images of the Black Magus for a wide audience, and the 2 phases of On Being Present, a potent visual exhibition on the Uffizi website, organized by Justin Randolph Thompson. My initial idea for African Venice stemmed from work I did in 2002-2003 as project scholar for the artist Fred Wilson's Speak of Me as I Am, an installation in the American Pavilion at the 2003 Venice Biennale. I was trying to supply Wilson with the largest possible data set for his visual meditations on historical and contemporary Blackness in Venice. And to that end, I burrowed through my research notes to compile a checklist of images of Black Africans by Venetian artists, which now runs to around 750 items, though many of these works are no longer in Venice itself. Compiling the checklist reminded me of something I had learned in earlier iconographic research, that while pinpointing iconographic changes in key individual images is valuable, it's also crucial to understand the breadth of representation of particular motifs, to think about the frequency of a certain kind of representation, even when many of the iterations are derivative or modest in aesthetic quality. Working on the Venice checklist and later the guidebook also made me consider the difference between fully public works, often on a larger scale, and those that were intended for a much more select audience, Durs Katharina, for example. On a related note, I include in the guidebook a few major works that are currently largely off limits to the general public in the hopes that pressure from my readers might encourage greater accessibility. The reaction to African Venice has so far been encouraging. There have been positive reviews in both Il Manifesto and L'Osservatore Romano, which seems like something of a feat. And it is slated to be released in the US and Britain through Penn State Press in March or April. It's occurred to me that a similar formula could be applied to Florence and/or Rome, and the rest of my talk today should be understood as a very preliminary foray into the lay of the land in Florence. I say preliminary because I have not yet had the chance to look comprehensively at the contents of Florentine churches, which was an essential component of my method in Venice. In my focus on the story of the Magi, the most important venue for the representation of Black people in European Christian art, I'm reverting to a problem that puzzled me many years ago when working on my dissertation. Richard Trexler's 1978 essay, The Magi Enter Florence, and before that, Rob Hatfield's 1970 investigation of the Florentine Compagnia dei Magi, have long since brought attention to the conspicuous social and artistic fascination with the three wise men in early modern Florentine culture. But Florentine art is somewhat eccentric compared to other Italian and Western European schools in its representation of people of color in the Magi story. While artists in the city were relatively quick to take up the 13th century Sienese invention of one or more Black attendants to a trio of white Magi, they were among the last in Europe to endorse the burgeoning trend of a Black African magus. It first emerged in German lands in the late 1300s and 1400s. And while the Uffizi can boast of housing two of the most significant and exquisite images of the Black Magus in all of Christian art, by Andrea Mantegna and Albrecht Dürer, these are, as we shall see, later arrivals in Florence and bear no original connection to the city. Let me begin with a brief introduction to the early evolution of the originally biblical story of the Magi who came to adore the infant Christ. Mentioned only in one gospel, Matthew's, the biblical account fails to specify how many of them there were and only says that they, quote, came from the east, unquote. The word Magi was associated with sages, that is to say, wise men, in the Zoroastrian tradition, and they follow a distinctive star toward Bethlehem, stopping first to inquire of the unhelpful Herod, and then being warned in a divine dream to return home without revisiting that evil monarch. This tantalizing tale soon began to be fleshed out with concrete details and symbolic associations. There were three of them, based on Matthew's mention of their three gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were kings as well as sages, based on correlation with Old Testament prophecies. They were of different ages, and they were endowed with names, Melchior, Balthazar, Caspar. Good baseline for their later representation in Florence is afforded by a 12th century sculptural relief in nearby Pistoia and a Dugento mosaic in the Florentine baptistry. Three crowned men with similar complexions, distinguished only by their facial hair to indicate an old, middle-aged, and a young man. This imagery was then the norm throughout Christian Europe. That norm was first radically altered in Tuscany, but not in Florence, by Nicola Pisano's 1265-68 relief for the pulpit of the Siena Duomo, which conspicuously includes two African men on camels as part of the Magi's journey to Bethlehem. There are only a few earlier images with any Magi in attendance at all, including one by Nicola himself, and they are typically a single ethnically undistinguished groom for the Magi's horses. No medieval textual source for African Magian attendance is known, and I and others have argued that the iconographic change here was prompted by the appearance in Siena at this time of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen's grandson, Conradin, with the ethnically diverse entourage his grandfather had favored. This iconographic innovation was repeated in later works from the Pisano workshop elsewhere in Tuscany, but it took some time to appear in Florentine art. Giotto and his followers, even as they sometimes accepted the idea of a few attendants, avoided Black ones. The earliest Florentine example I know is from the predella of a 1379 altarpiece by Giovanni del Biondo in the Rinuccini Chapel in Santa Croce, where at least one and probably two Black attendants are visible in the scene of the journey of the Magi, one at the very top, and then part of another figure there at the left. A generation later, between 1404 and 1407, Lorenzo Ghiberti took up the idea in his famous first set of bronze doors for the baptistry, where the most conspicuous of a group of Magian attendants is an African man with curled hair and a monkey perched on his head. By this time, Ethiopian Christian pilgrims are documented as having passed through Florence, which might help to account for the prominence of Ghiberti's figure, which is, by the way, easily visible on the third row of reliefs from the bottom. Even before Ghiberti's work was finally installed, however, the painter Lorenzo Monaco had created a boldly rendered African youth among the ample entourage of the Magi in a large picture, probably for an altar in the church of Sant Egidio, and he's right there in the center in pink. Lorenzo Monaco's teeming crowd was likely an inspiration for Gentile da Fabriano's iconic Strozzi altarpiece, completed in 1423 for Santa Trinita. Gentile's extensive retinue is of an unparalleled splendor, featuring luxury fabrics from the Middle East, some with Pseudo-Arabic inscriptions, as well as exotic Asian and/or African animals, but no Black African individuals appear here. The authority of Gentile's masterfully executed and widely admired work may have, at least temporarily, obstructed any local attempts to follow up on Ghiberti's and Lorenzo Monaco's Black characters. The Tondo adoration of the Magi, begun by Fra Angelico around 1440 and completed by Filippo Lippi at a later date, possibly made for members of the ascendant Medici family, and thus perhaps related to their deep involvement in the confraternity known as the Compagnia dei Magi, and its periodic procession through the streets of Florence on the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th. This work features a vast crowd of retainers, but again, Black African figures are absent. However, in Domenico Veneziano's Tondo of the Adoration of about 1440, for a still unknown patron, we find a reference going all the way back to Nicola Pisano, as an African youth in a simple white garment rides a camel at the far right. And this might remind us a little bit of what the whiteness of the garment discussed by Denva. Meanwhile, current events were about to make Black characters in the Adoration story seem more attractive. During the second phase of the Ecumenical Council of Florence in 1441, a group of Ethiopian monks from a monastery in Jerusalem arrived in the city, and despite the fact that they were clear that they had no authorization to negotiate unification with the papal church, as the Byzantine delegation was doing, they were widely noticed. The arrival of these and other representatives of Eastern Christian churches seemed a kind of reenactment of the Magi story to many observers at that time. It's not surprising that in the extra-large cell used by Cosimo de' Medici in the Dominican Friary of San Marco, Fra Angelico in 1441 to 1442 included at least one Black African man in the Magian retinue. Unlike the other attendants, he is hatless, so his characteristically African hair can be shown. The young Benozzo Gozzoli was working with Fra Angelico in this cell, and 2 decades later, Benozzo had the chance to revisit this imagery in the fabulous paintings of the Journey of the Magi lining the walls of the tiny chapel inside the Palazzo Medici. But here, another and more fateful contemporary social phenomenon seems to be referenced. The wonderfully rendered black archer who stands before row after row of other Magian attendants on horseback, many clearly portraits of the Medici and their allies and employees, does not embody an Ethiopian monk, but rather the growing ranks of enslaved Black Africans appearing in Florence. There is as yet no documentation of such an African in the Medici household as of 1459, though I'm hoping that Kate and Lawrence will contradict me on that, right? But the Portuguese West African slave trade was beginning to supply a long-standing Tuscan demand for enslaved domestic workers. And we know that at his untimely death in 1459, Florence's most notable aristocratic celebrity, the Cardinal of Portugal, left behind as part of his property a black man known as Bastian. The bow held by Gozzoli's figure may be a visual pun on St. Sebastian's arrows. Gozzoli's creations solidified the iconography of the Black Magian attendant in Florence, successively manifested in such works as Ghirlandaio's Tondo of 1487, completed a year after the Florentine merchant Bartolomeo Marchione became a major investor in the expansion of the Portuguese slave trade. Figure is up there. Filippo Lippi's 1496 altarpiece for, too far. 1496 altarpiece for San Donato a Scopeto, and Andrea della Robbia's glazed terracotta sculpture of about 1500 to 1510. None of the Florentine works discussed so far depict any of the Magi themselves as Black. This bolder iconography originates north of the Alps, relying on an influential account of the legend of the Magi written by a German monk before 1375. Dominant in much of German art by 1460, the Black Magus's major debut in Italy was in a painting from the early 1460s by the Paduan Andrea Mantegna, executed for his new Gonzaga patrons in Mantua. Though relatively small in scale, it is a splendid work, and the Black Magus, youngest and third in line, as in most German depictions, is accompanied by 4 African retainers, as in the Italian tradition. But there was no immediate repercussion across the Apennines in Florence. Instead, the Black Magus first, and somewhat surreptitiously, entered Florence in a small detail within Hugo van der Goes' Portinari altarpiece, 1477 to 78, for the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova. Hugo's main subject was, of course, the adoration of the shepherds, but behind a Portinari patron saint in the right wing, we see the Magi approaching, and Hugo's meticulous oil technique makes it clear the youngest of the 3 is a Black man in a white hat. It's hard to know to what extent this imagery registered among Florentine artists and audiences. For the next 30 years, it seems that no major Florentine master adopted Hugo's iconographic model. Even Domenico Ghirlandaio, in his 1485 Hugo-dependent Adoration of the Shepherds for the Sassetti Chapel in Santa Trinita, excluded any Africans among the Magi, who are approaching at the left, and you can see in the left detail their appearance, and their retinue. No Black figure at all there. Although, if one looks at Ghirlandaio's surrounding frescoes, it may be noted that a Black retainer does appear in the chapel as a whole, right? And Kate Lowe has suggested that this woman may denote one of the Sassetti family's domestic servants. This is the figure at the very far left edge, sorry, of this composition. Leonardo's unfinished adoration for San Donato a Scopeto shows no trace of ethnic differentiation among the Magi or their retinue. And the same is true of Botticelli's and Cosimo Rosselli's important large-scale Magi pictures. And here's Cosimo Rosselli. Instead, in the years around 1500, there was experimentation with the motif of the Black Magus among lesser local artists, although some of these generally smaller and stiffer works are difficult to date precisely. And in a few cases, there can be doubts about whether the blackness of the Magus might have been added later, a corrective practice found elsewhere in European art. And in what follows, I'm particularly indebted to help from Jonathan Nelson in tracing new dates and attributions for some of these works. For example, after conservation of a painting by Biagio d'Antonio, now in Dijon, a white youngest Magus, right? This is the post-conservation image, was revealed beneath an erstwhile black one, almost certainly overpainted later. In a much earlier mid-century picture attributed to Pezzolino, old photos suggest several different complexions for one of the Magi, lighter here, darker there. But more recent conservation has revealed that that figure was entirely in later interpolation, okay? Did not even exist in the original circa 1450 composition. Three works that may be from the mid-1490s show an unusual iconographic twist, otherwise more common in northern Italy. The Black Magus is not the youngest of the three, but evidently second in age and precedence. A curious picture now in Norfolk, Virginia, attributed to Francesco Botticini, who died in 1497, depicts a Magus with skin so dark that his facial features are hard to make out, and with a strange curling beard. Condo, attributed to Francesco's son Raffaello Botticini, whose date is estimated around 1495, features a more credible Black Magus, and let me show you a detail, along with 7 African attendants to his right, and a circa 1495 painting attributed to one of Ghirlandaio's students, known as Pseudo Granacci, rounds out this subgroup. In each of these, the youngest seems to be white, the oldest is white, and this leaves the African Magus somewhere in the middle. Finally, there's a more conventional approach to the Black Magus with the young Black king in the circa 1510, 1500 to 1510 picture attributed to Michelangelo Mencherini. All these relatively small works. The dates and perhaps the attributions of these 4 early examples are provisional, but assuming they're roughly correct, what might account for this shift? Beyond the authorship by less ambitious artists with a weaker commitment to the otherwise growing emphasis on idealization of the figure, something which tended to tamp down interest in racial differentiation, there's also the fact that by 1495, the Medici were in exile. While it's hard to prove, I have a suspicion that as long as the Medici used the regal pageantry of the Compagnia dei Magi to reinforce their power and that of their allies, the introduction of non-white Magi in painting was subtly discouraged. I would suggest that it is not a complete coincidence that the first major instance of an authoritative, large-scale, public Black Magus in Florence dates to 1511. the last year of the Republican interval that endured until the 1512 return of the Medici family to power. Andrea del Sarto's fresco in the atrium of Santissima Annunziata, part of a Marian cycle executed by multiple artists, focuses unusually on the arrival of the Magi rather than their adoration of the child, a choice appropriate to a forecourt. The composition is also innovative, with the three Magi in a diagonal row at the center of the composition. Though he is a bit further back in space, once again, as in the works by Botticini and Pseudogranacci, the Black Magus does not clearly read as the youngest of the three. This beardless figure here would be the youngest. Though he's a bit further back in space, the Black Magus is highlighted against the landscape and stands out more than his colleagues. Several Black characters, including a horseman with a falcon, appear in the entourage. The Magus and the falconer are somewhat lighter in complexion than another retainer in a blue hat, suggesting some familiarity with the varied skin colors of African peoples. The Magus has the relaxed grace and elegance that Andrea was particularly skilled in conveying. The painter has found a way to incorporate African identity into idealizing high Renaissance norms. The return of the Medici to power was not accompanied by a renewed surge in depictions of the Magi, Black or white. One of the few large images of the Magi in the following decades, Pontormo's circa 1523 Adoration, follows the dominant Quattrocento conventions excluding Black figures. However, one small but exquisite work with the Black Magus is associated with Medici patronage. An illuminated initial M for Magi by Monte di Giovanni del Fora of the Magi seeing the star from a 1516 antiphonary commemorating Pope Leo X's visit to Florence. It's worth noting that the African figure here is once again not the youngest of the three. Despite the likelihood that the first Medici Duke of Florence, Alessandro, had African ancestry, the story of the Magi evidently had little appeal for local patrons during the first half-century of the dukedom. Beginning in the 1580s, and no doubt in response to Counter-Reformation aspirations to global evangelization, paintings featuring the Magi again become popular in Florence. By 1587, Mantegna's landmark Adoration from the 1460s was in the collection of Don Antonio de' Medici, son of Ferdinando I and Bianca Capello, and it may have encouraged the production of a series of altarpieces, none especially remarkable in themselves, but noteworthy as a group, by Francesco Brina for Santa Maria sul Prato, detail at the left, by Jacopo Ligozzi for Santissima Concezione, in the sort of upper left quadrant there, by Santi di Tito, the figure in the lower left corner there, for San Donato dei Vecchietti, by Sigismondo Coccapani, closely following Santi di Tito, for the convent of San Baldassare in Converciano, one of the very few sacred institutions named for one of the Magi anywhere, by Gregorio Pagani on the left in the Carmine, by Il Cigoli for San Pier Maggiore, and now at Stourhead in the center, and then at the right by Cristofano Allori, which is now in the Pitti. We don't know where it was originally displayed. And finally by Aurelio Lomi, who made a specialty of this subject with other examples in Pisa and Lucca. This work is in the Ridolfi Chapel in Santo Spirito. Both Santi di Tito and Lomi retain the idea of a Black Magus who is not the youngest of the three. The others go with the more conventional approach. After 1620, the frequency of paintings of the Magi rapidly wanes, even as at the ducal court, a new interest is taken in pictorial records of Black African footmen and performers in Medici households. However, a 1642 publication, perhaps written as early as 1620, by the Medici court intellectual Alessandro Adimari, presented an elaborate drama of the Magi. This play was dedicated to Anna, sister of the current Medici Grand Duke, and its three protagonists were described as Re Vecchio, Re Moro, Re Giovane, meaning that once again the Black Magus was presented as middle in age. In 1680 to 83, another Black Magus by Volterrano appeared in the complicated Marian cupola frescoes of Santissima Annunziata, perhaps a nod to Andrea del Sarto's earlier fresco. But the 18th century saw relatively little in the way of Magian imagery. The last major milestone in the Florentine history of the Black Magus is instead the 1792 transferal of Durer's majestic adoration to the Uffizi, where it still reigns, along with Mantegna's picture, and at Santissima Annunziata, Andrea del Sarto's fresco, as one of the three most potent articulations of the figure of the Black Magus in this city. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your interesting talk, tracing the appearance and disappearance of Black African individuals in depictions of the Magi. Now I will introduce the third and last speaker of this first session, Vera-Simone Schulz. Vera-Simone Schulz is a W1 professor for transcultural art history at Louvain University in Lunenburg and associate scholar at the Kunsthistorisch Institute in Florence. She's the principal investigator of the international research project called Material Migrations, Mamluk Metalwork Across Afro-Eurasia, funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation and PI of the international research project Epistemologies of Conviviality, Temporalities and Aesthetics of the Built Environment Across the Horn of Africa and Beyond. And that is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. Holding a PhD in art history from Humboldt University, her research has been supported by the BART Graduate Center in New York, the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, and the University of Cambridge, among others. She worked at the crossroads of African, Islamic, and European art histories and critical museology, questioning canons and canonization processes, and contributing to the overcoming of traditional notions of periphery and center in the discipline of art history. Florence.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation, and many, many thanks to Dennis for organizing all of this and bringing us together for this wonderful gathering, and to our host institutes, NIKI and NYU-Florence. It's a very great pleasure to be here. And yes. During the pandemic, when many digital initiatives went viral, Peter Brathwaite's project to recover the history of Black presence in visual culture was one of the most notable ones, contributing to the Getty Museum challenge that household objects should be used to restage well-known paintings. Brathwaite drew on the most diverse artifacts as props for his reimagined compositions. These could be yellow washing lines standing for beams of light, or a plastic bottle filled with frying oil replacing a golden vessel. Brathwaite called his photographic series Recovering Black Portraiture, and among the actual portraits he restaged was also one of the most famous portraits of medieval Black history, that of Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Kingdom of Mali. Enthroned on a chair behind a net crisscrossing the picture space, the composition referred to the depiction of Mansa Musa in the Catalan Atlas, with its lines derived from portolan charts, a representation of parts of the world that lay at the horizon of its commissioner and maker, the King of France, in the workshop of Abraham Cresques on the island of Majorca in 1375. This portrait of Mansa Musa has received much scholarly attention and has also been the cover image of the exhibition Caravans of Gold, curated by Catherine Berzog at the Block Museum in 2019. Yet it also exemplifies a discrepancy about the famous narratives around a rich king, narratives that spread across the Mediterranean in the 14th century and led to a king of Mali having visual relevance on a map for the King of France, and the multitude of objects that also exemplify pre-modern transcultural exchange and long-distance relationships. In my talk, I will focus on some of the latter that do not only show the entangled histories of Africa and Europe during the late medieval and early modern period, but that also mirror the worldview reaching from West Africa to Europe and as far as Asia, as it appears in the Catalan Atlas. Focusing first on connectivity across the Afro-Eurasian world and then on Afro-Eurasian entanglements in 15th century Florence, I will close with some considerations for transcultural art histories in the 21st century. Mansa Musa himself exemplified Afro-Eurasian connectivity, a Muslim from Mali who undertook the Hajj, that is the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, thereby stopping in Cairo, where his stay famously let the gold price collapse because of his wealth and expenditures for precious objects and enslaved people that he brought back with him to West Africa. The ruler thus becoming known not only across the Islamic world, but also in Europe, where his portrait made it onto the Catalan Atlas. The manifold artifacts that Mansa Musa brought with him to Mali from Cairo have not been preserved, but they may well have included inlaid metalwork, for which the Mamluk Empire in today's Syria and Egypt was famous at the time. Mamluk metal objects were made for export to Yemen, as you can see from the copper-red 5-petal roses on this preserved platter today at the Louvre. Consisting of brass or bronze and inlaid with gold and silver, this type of metalwork was also highly sought after in Europe, as this passage from Simone Sigoli's pilgrimage account shows, who wrote about the markets in Damascus, where, quote, also is made a great deal of brass basins and pitchers, and really they appear of gold. And then on the said basins and pitchers are made figures and foliage and other fine work in silver, so that it is a very beautiful thing to see, end of quote. In awe, he exclaimed, quote, verily, if you had money in the bone of your leg, without fail you would break it off to buy these things, end of quote. Mamluk metal objects also inspired Italian artists who incorporated them into their pictorial spaces, such as in this case of the Dream of St. Ursula by Carpaccio, where, as Anna Contadini has shown, a metal bucket hanging from the cupboard on the wall closely resembles a Mamluk metal bucket preserved in the church treasury of Treviso. Yet Mamluk metal objects did not only enter European church treasuries as trans-Mediterranean artifacts, but also found their ways to church treasuries in the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, in Lalibela and elsewhere, where, just as in the case of Treviso, many of them are preserved until today. And they traveled across the Sahara to West Africa already in the 14th and early 15th century, very shortly after they had been made, as we know from an archaeological finding of a Mamluk metal bowl at a gravesite in northern Nigeria at Derby Takushe. Here, very likely, a female member of the local nobility was buried in the early 15th century with an assemblage of precious objects, including cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, precious pearls, golden artifacts, but also a metal bowl from Mamluk Syria or Egypt. Together with the Mamluk metal objects preserved in Ethiopia, the Mamluk bowl that has been excavated at Derby Takushe turns our story of the itineraries of Mamluk metalwork into one in which Europe and Italy are just at the margin of Afro-Eurasian connectivity. A connectivity by means of mobile objects that was even wider, an even wider Afro-Eurasian one, as we will see in a moment. Hidden in plain sight in Italian early modern visual culture was also a motif that tells us yet another story about Afro-European, but also Afro-Eurasian connectivity in the pre-modern period. The pictorial motif of the giraffe that became prominent in Florentine painting and beyond from the late 15th century onwards. Commonly referred to as the Medici giraffe in scholarship and popular culture, something that Angelica Grum has very well deconstructed. This motif referred to an actual living giraffe that Florence had received as a gift from the ambassador of the Mamluk Empire and of the Mamluk Sultan in 1487. In the late medieval and early modern period, the Mamluk Empire was both a famous center for the manufacture of certain goods, such as preciously inlaid metalwork, but even more than that, it was also a hub of transit for people and objects from the most diverse regions and of all kinds of materials, as well as for elements of flora and fauna that were traded or gifted and thus passed through Cairo. The motif of a giraffe started to appear in all kinds of different scenes. In Italian painting after the animal had arrived as a gift from the Mamluk Sultan, including in a depiction of St. Mark preaching in Alexandria by Gentile and Giovanni Bellini, dated to 1405-1407, and this created in Venice only about a decade after Carpaccio's Dream of St. Ursula, featuring the Mamluk metal bucket dating to 1495, so two different connections to the Mamluk Empire at that time. Both cases are examples of trans-regional connectivity that do not only center the Mediterranean as a realm of transcultural exchange, particularly between the Mamluk Empire and Italy, but also point to wider Afro-Eurasian horizons with their far-reaching entanglements. The Medici giraffe was in fact just one of two famous giraffe stories exemplifying trans-regional connectivity in the 15th century, the other one being the giraffe that was brought from the east coast of Africa to Bengal, from where it was then taken to China by Chen He in 1414. The journey of this giraffe in two steps across the Indian Ocean occurred in the context of Chinese maritime expeditions from 1405 to 1433 and has been told by Tansen Sen and others. Travelers from Malindi in today's Kenya had brought giraffes to Bengal, from where one of them was sent to Emperor Yongle in China as tribute. Much has been said about how this giraffe was integrated by some as a qilin upon its arrival in China, a mythical animal often described as a Chinese unicorn that had a long prehistory of its iconographic depictions in various media materials, but then started to have visual resemblances with giraffes after the arrival of the famous giraffe from East Africa via Bengal. If we think of the giraffe that arrived from the Mamluk Sultan in Florence and then had a great impact on the visual culture in 15th and 16th century Italy, together with the giraffe that crossed the Indian Ocean from East Africa and was then gifted by Bengal to China, with its impact on Chinese visual culture in the early modern period, we have two cases of Afro-Eurasian connectivity exemplifying issues of mobility and trans-regional entanglements, the roles of hubs of transit, such as Mamluk Cairo or the court in Bengal, and the complicated journeys, in this case of two animals, that open up to wider Afro-Eurasian horizons in the early modern period. If we then return to our case study, we can open up a similarly wide horizon. In Italy, these objects were cherished so highly that they did not only appear as painted objects, such as in the case of Carpaccio's Dream of St. Ursula, but Italian artists became so inspired by them that they came to shape the very gold grounds of Italian panel painting in the early 15th century. Gentile da Fabriano's adoration of the Magi, as Paul has just already elucidated, shows the halos of Joseph and the Madonna featuring clearly visible Pseudo-Arabic script. Fred Lehmhuis suggested that these golden halos featuring Pseudo-Arabic inscriptions may well have been inspired by Mamluk metal platters that were equally characterized by Arabic writing along the rims and that were made in such large dimensions, as you can see from this example now in Detroit, that they could be easily imagined as framing the heads of Mary or other saints. A suggestion that was then taken up by Rosamund Mack, Alexander Nagel, and other scholars, and that makes sense, since although pseudo-inscriptions occurred also in the gold grounds of Italian panel painting, including golden halos, at least since the 13th century, it was in the first half of the 15th century that they came to be clearly visible from near and afar, given the specific gold ground working techniques in which the inscriptions were then applied. In the 1420s, beholders of Italian panel paintings, such as those by Masaccio and Gentili da Fabriano, were meant to see the Pseudo-Arabic inscriptions decorating the halos of Mary and other saints. In the 1420s, Mamluk metalwork thus found its way to Italy, where it came to shape the gold grounds of Italian panel painting. It also arrived in West Africa, south of the Sahara, as we've seen, where it was buried alongside a local noblewoman at Drobita Couché in the first half of the 15th century, as well as in Ethiopia. Yet the radius of the distribution of Mamluk metalwork was even wider. If we take a look towards Asia, where Mamluk metalwork objects were responded to by Chinese artists under the reign of Emperor Yongle in the 1420s. The same emperor, by the way, who had received the giraffe from East Africa via Bengal. During his reign in the 1420s, porcelain artists in Ming China evoked Mamluk metal stands in blue and white porcelain. And just as it was happening in Italy in paintings by Gentile da Fabriano and Masaccio during the same period, they turned the Arabic inscriptions of the Mamluk metal objects into Pseudo-Arabic script. When we look at the itineraries of this metalwork across the Afro-Eurasian world more broadly, we thus arrive at a group of objects that found their ways to the most distant regions of the world, to Europe, West Africa, and China, partly at the very same time, but that have been treated very differently in the discipline of art history, or some of them for a long time not been treated at all. We are, in fact, confronted with a group of objects that challenge traditional subdisciplinary divides of art history into European, Islamic, African, and Asian art histories and archaeology, and that call for closer collaborations and for overcoming such divides. And here is just one example of how, of course, museums are still categorized by these divisions. But that also challenged Eurocentric understandings of center and periphery when they let the world turn around the Mamluk Empire in today's Syria and Egypt for a moment for this particular case study, but also raised the question about the provincial position of Europe and Italy in a world that has been entangled over widest distances, a world that should more often be regarded from the perspective of the majority world, turning not least also the discipline of art history more often upside down. And I'm coming to my last point. Since 2017, Theo Imani has been working on a series of image dialogues and confrontations, positioning images of Black protagonists next to famous European artworks, such as in this case, a confrontation between a Guadalupean woman by Augustus Sherman from 1911 and the profile of a young lady by Piero del Pollaiuolo dated to around 1465, or Giovanni il Bentivoglio from circa 1474 to 1477, and a self-portrait of the artist from 2018. In contrast to Peter Brathwaite's work, and in contrast to the project On Being Present, Recovering Blackness in the Uffizi Galleries, led by Justin Randolph-Thompson and the Recovery Plan, Theo Imani's series does not highlight the representation of Black figures in the arts, but shows how much the canon of images has been shaped by white protagonists, and how image production has been shaped by European works of art and our ways of seeing, by European works of art with white protagonists. And at the same time, his series showcases to us the possibility of an otherwise, what is being marginalized and overlooked because of a dominant visual culture that could equally be a starting point to tell completely different stories when focusing on the second image in the visual confrontations. In the case of the Mamluk metal objects traveling across widest distances and transgressing traditional disciplinary boundaries of diverse art historical subdisciplines, but also of alleged hierarchies between different media, so-called high arts, decorative arts, categories that they all put into question, there would be many possible stories to tell and to follow, not least also of how a wider transregional perspective sheds new light on European and Italian art history. Just thinking of the way how a closer consideration of these objects complicates notions of geographical and temporal distance, of the traditional focus of the discipline on receptions of antiquity when read from a transcultural point of view. I'm just mentioning this passage by Petrarch who wrote about Mamluk metalwork from Syria and Damascus in relation to metalwork in antiquity, likening Mamluk metalwork in 14th century Italy of his own time to the way how Greek metalwork used to intrigue Romans in an antique Mediterranean context. Quote, Petrarch, when Mummius captured Corinth by armed force and sacked and burned it to the ground, many of the statues of gold, silver, and bronze, once so plentiful in ancient Corinth, which somehow had escaped the hands of the conquerors, melted in the flames, so that the veins of all kinds of metal seemed to flow in one gushing stream. This was the origin of these priceless vessels, and from the ruins of a city, luxury derived its name. The craze did not start in the city when it perished, but the material for the craze was prepared there. In this sense, Corinth was the source of this madness. Now it is from Damascus that these vessels come and capture your eyes and your minds. End of quote. But I want to close this talk by highlighting three themes that are crucial for the present and future of art history in dialogue with other disciplines, as well as at the crossroads of academia and the arts, and by sounding out what this particular case study, among many others, could contribute to these discourses. The first one centers the transition from object-centered to people-centered approaches, and it's something that Dennis already drew on in the introduction. The turn towards the object that occurred in the discipline of art history during the past 20 years has been crucial for the reevaluation of objects of the so-called applied arts, textiles, metalwork, ceramics, to name but a few, in comparison to media such as painting and dialogue, to media such as painting, sculpture, and architecture that have traditionally been valued more highly in art historical scholarship of European art. It has also been significant with regard to attempts for less Eurocentric art histories, since particularly fields such as Islamic, African, Asian, and American art history have long centered artifacts of the most diverse materials as objects that are highly valuable for scholarly scrutiny. Transcultural art history has both benefited from and contributed to this turn towards the object. Yet as much as this has been a vital step, the criticism regarding this focus during the last years is very much legitimate when projects privileging objects have been called to include also more people-centered approaches. This call is also relevant for our case study. In the West African context, the itinerary of Mamluk metal objects was not confined to their arrival in northern Nigeria. They've also been documented in Ghana since the 19th century, where they may well have arrived already during the 14th and 15th centuries, just like the metal bowl at Derbita Couché. Raymond Silverman wrote a PhD about these Mamluk metal bowls in Ghana in the 1970s and early 1980s, exemplifying the life of these objects in different rural contexts in the late 20th century, where few, such as this Mamluk metal bowl that I photographed in Atebubu near Techiman in the Bronga Harbor region in Ghana in 2016, still remain till today. Many others are not extant anymore. These cases show that the 14th and 15th century objects from Mamluk, Syria, and Egypt have still relevance for people living in Ghana nowadays. They point to the need to study not only the lives but afterlives and the many different roles they could obtain in the societies in which they arrived. At the same time, these artifacts complexify the topic of restitution, which is also a people-centered issue when there has long been the proposition to speak of cultural belongings instead of objects for such items. The Mamluk metal bowl that can still be found in Atebubu in central Ghana once arrived there from today's Syria and Egypt, but it has long become a cultural belonging to the people in this village in the Bronga Harbor region. Yet while this shows how transcultural dynamics and the mobility of objects sometimes across widest distances complicate issues of restitution and cultural belonging, when the latter can be inherently transcultural, even though at the same time highly local, our very same case study also addresses the topic of loot and restitution. Directly and severely, when an early modern metal bowl from West Africa, a so-called Ghanaian kuduo that was made in response to and in dialogue with Mamluk metal objects that had arrived in the region, is now in the collection of the British Museum. The kuduo is directly part of our story. Just as Mamluk metal objects inspired artists in Italy and China, they also inspired artists in West Africa, where not only the shape but also the decoration was taken up, even turning the Arabic inscriptions of the Mamluk metal objects again into pseudo-Arabic script, as had occurred in the halos of Masaccio's and Gentile da Fabriano's paintings, and in the blue and white porcelain stands in Ming China. In West Africa, Ghanaian Kudur could equally feature Pseudo-Arabic script, now combined with local imagery such as crocodiles or in this case mudfish. Having been looted from the then Gold Coast, today's Ghana, by the British, numerous West African Kudur, including the one that you see here, ended up on the art market or directly in the British Museum. Many of them were once part of the collection of Sir Cecil Hamilton Armitage, who had begun his career as an army officer in the Gold Coast in 1895, and who had been involved in the Ashanti Wars of 1895, 1896, and 1900. But our particular Kudur here came from the collection of Frank Best, which brings us to the second theme I would like to highlight, that of heritage and the environment. Best was a managing director of the Ofin River Mine, a gold mine in central Ghana, during the last years of the 19th century, and later of the Naraguta Tin Mine in northern Nigeria. During this time, he amassed ethnographic material, much of which he later donated to the British Museum between 1909 and 1922. This particular Kudur, however, entered the collection of the British Museum as a donation by his daughter in 1955. According to the 1955 register, it had been retrieved from the depth of 30 feet beneath the bed of the river Ofin in the year 1909. These issues show the entanglements of this topic with the history of colonialism, but also with colonial legacies, the history of mining and extractive industries, the exploitation of resources by colonial powers, and their intersections with the history of art history and the history of museums. Note that this map showing the history of mining and mining market sites in the late 19th century is largely identical with those locations where metal bows have been found. Atibubu is also on the map in the center, you see it. In Ghana, when Europeans were active in the area, as well as ongoing power imbalances and asymmetries, not only the manifold legacies of intersections between heritage and the environment until today, these are mining sites that were opened during the colonial period and are still in use, but the fact that the Kudur, which was taken during the exploitative mining mission in central Ghana, is still in the British Museum. The issue of restitution is deeply linked to the necessity of implementing new relational ethics, as Felvin Sarr and Benedict Savoy have pointed out. However, new relational ethics, questions of social justice and epistemic restitution, are also highly relevant for academia more broadly, beyond the question of the restitution of objects, not only with regard to the rightful claim of restitution of cultural belongings, and this is my last point. These new relational ethics that are needed entail many levels and dimensions. I would just like to draw your attention to an online series that I co-convened together with Gertrude Arba-Mansaiva Dizenyo from the University of Ghana. With him, I direct this project, Material Migrations, that takes a broader look at site-specific contexts of intersections between African and Islamic art history, including their many entanglements with Europe, with doctoral and postdoctoral fellows of the project in Ghana, Nigeria, and now for the coming years also Ethiopia. One of the speakers whom we invited was Olusegun Opadeji, who spoke about the history of the archaeological excavation at Derby Takushe from a Nigerian point of view, focusing on Nigerian actors in this excavation project and story, and on Nigerian counter-stories to the official narrative of the excavation. Such transcontinental collaborations and dialogue are crucial, since all too often African scholars are still marginalized in academic settings. And while our next in-person conference of this project will actually take place in Ghana, we are planning a conference in Florence in 2026, and this might be a possibility to continue this dialogue, also with Paul's wonderful presentation about the I just don't see where it's at now, but yes, about the role in Florentine paintings. Part of Theo Imani's image series, Image Confrontations, are also dialogues between early modern European compositions featuring figures of authority in dialogue with youngsters or in dialogue among themselves, juxtaposing a detail of Titian meeting the young Paolo Veronese in Antonio Zona and a photograph of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, meeting a young boy at Mooresville, North Carolina in the 1960s. Or St. Erasmus and St. Maurice, one black Agus, by Matthias Grünewald, with a photograph showing Dwight Eisenhower with Kwame Nkrumah at the White House in the 1960s. Point to three key issues. Firstly, the relevance of archives of Black history. And I'm just pointing to the crucial work done by Justin Randolph-Thompson and the recovery plan, and with whom it's always a very great pleasure to collaborate. And this is connected to my second point, the relevance of all of these topics for Black Italy today. And thirdly, to think about the relevance of these topics across epochs, when it means what it means for the majority world today to unearth stories of Afro-Eurasian connectivity since the pre-modern period, and to take inspiration from alliances between academic and artistic research for our understandings also of the early modern period. If we take these pairs of images by Imani seriously, we can even go as far as Seda Hartman with her concept of critical fabulation, that will become a topic later in the conference, but that then is also used beautifully for its description of the portrait of Katharina and Katharina's potential point of view with regard to this, the production of this image. And imagine the conversations that were not only happening in Florence and at the Medici, in the Medici environment, when they collected Mamluk metal objects, or when the Giraffe arrived in Florence, but also to imagine the conversations that took place at Durbutecuche when the decision was taken to bury alongside to bury a Mamluk metal object and other precious items alongside the local noblewoman. The Mamluk metal artifacts that are discussed in this paper are part of a world reaching from West Africa to East Asia, in which Europe was but a periphery entangled with these other world regions, in which the Medici in Florence, the Chinese emperor, and the nobility in northern Nigeria were all intrigued by Mamluk metal objects at the very same time. A fact that can animate us to let these objects talk beyond Eurocentric categories and elite hierarchies that we inherited from 19th and early 20th century, that is colonial period scholarship, and to make a change and meet at eye level in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.